Hello everybody, it's Grandmama. Time for another story from a hometown scrapbook by Ben Weatherwax. Alexander Zatini Agee. Hello there. Every so often we find a page in our scrapbook that contains the story of an interesting resident of our hometown. We have found a yarn about such fabulous characters as Ed Finch, the promoter philanthropist, Michigan, the mysterious little trainer who was a harbinger of seasons, saltwater men like Captain Wickenot, and frontiermen like William O'Leary. These men, whose lives were jam-packed with color, wrote the story of our part of the world when it was young, and they are part of Grays Harbor heritage with stories of their history. But there are others who came along later to contribute in their own way to the many-hued patterns of Grays Harbor history. Such men as little Billy Baker, Gloomy Trezzini, and Alexander Zatini Agee. Oh, you don't recall Alexander Zatini Agee? Perhaps not by that name. You may recall him as Alex Bora, the little tailor whose story was as fabulous as any yarn from the Arabian Nights. But as Alexander Zatini Agee, we find him here tonight. That was the name the Turks gave him when he was a merchant in Constantinople, and the name that befits the man whose story we find this evening in our hometown scrapbook. So when George has taken his customary few seconds for a word from our sponsor, we'll open the scrapbook to the story of our neighbor who left behind a luster and a legend that reads like an adventure story. Think hard now, and you'll know just where to place citizen Alex Bora, a resident of Aberdeen for nearly 20 years. On any of many days through the years from 1929 to 1947, he could be seen at the window of his little cleaning establishment on K Street, across from the Morrick Motel, his needle flying as he stitches the new knees in someone's trousers or lengthens a sleeve. If you knew him well that is, you might look in and be greeted with a blast of Greek Teconian's cola, and if you met on equal terms, there would be a round of thick, black, fragrant Turkish coffee served steaming in a demi-tasse and accompanied by a story of the ways and habits of other worlds that Alex had left behind. Alexander Bora was born in Macedonia when the Sultan Abdul Hamid ruled the restless land of independent people, and he was raised as any Grecian lad against the panorama of life that had changed but little since Christ walked the earth. A little the endless years that stretched back into the beginning of man's civilizations. The years of Alex's boyhood were filled with war and strife. As most Greek lads he knew grew with ambition to be soldiers, and when old enough joined the Macedonian army and fought in wars that crisscrossed themselves in aims. Between wars, he was an olive oil merchant. With his skins of oil, he peddled throughout the ancient streets of his native land. People called him Alexander Zatini Agee, Alexander the olive oil merchant. Now, if you knew Alexander Zatini Agee, you knew the twinkle in his eye and the tilt of his voice, the free way about him that stomped him as a street corner icon. Alexander wore no man's collar. He had lived in America when free men were turning on George III. He would have marched with Washington or ridden with light horse Harry Lee. He had lived in France in the days of the guillotine. He would have roused the mobs to storm the Bastille. For the free-spirited Bolivian and Sam Adams and Jeff Davis, the rebel heart, The little non-conforming spirit were part of the makeup of this extraordinary little man, and Alexander refused to conform. He opposed Turkish law. He upset the law and order of things, and then, when there was a price on his head, he fled to America. It was before the First World War. In fact, it was the last years of the Great Migration that was moving a giant slice of Europe's humanity to our shores and filling them past the old girl with a great torch and through the worn and marked hallways of Ellis Island to dump them into a way of life that accepted them rather than welcomed them. A newcomer must make his own place in the rough coast of order of things, unless they were friends ready to receive him and initiate him in the ways of the New World. He must cling to the rocky shore with his fingertips until native initiatives and a rudimentary education in American ways prepared him for the start in the new land. Alex was up for it. But fingerholds were few. He finally followed the mob of immigrants into New York's labor office and signed an employment contract, sight unseen, to work on a construction crew in Montana. He had worked several months before he learned that he had signed a contract that provided for no salary. He received his food, clothing, and a bed in a bunkhouse for a 10-hour day of hard work. His reaction was just what friends would expect from Alex. He walked off the job and left Montana behind. But he put himself into the West, which was to be his home for the rest of his life. A short term of wandering, with a stop at various spots, ended in Lewiston, Idaho, where he set up a tailoring establishment for 15 years. His flying needle made his way in the world. 15 years in which he learned the American way, married and started a family, and then in 1929, as the world's money markets were collapsing from their undermining, Alexander Zatini Agee came to Grace Harbor. He moved into the house in West 6th Street with his growing family and opened the model cleaners. Those were the fundamentals of his arrival. More important was the influence of the little man who was wise in the ways of the world and brought with him the lore and the secrets of countless ways of life. He made friends quickly with many people, not quick to take on new acquaintances, for the color and charm of wide worldliness was in his speech, and men far from home could sit down beside Alex's steam presser and converse with him in their native tongues. In addition to fluent English, he spoke Portuguese, Basque, Turk, Greek, Hebrew, and Siberian. During the First World War, he aided government agencies as an interpreter. There were no limits to his interest. He had an affection for old coins, souvenirs, and far-off places, and a bottomless bag of yarns of the parts of the world where he had been. When you knew him well, he would unfold a portion of an ancient parchment, more than 800 years old, containing a manuscript written in the time of the great Greek priest Christomos. Collectors had tried to buy it from him, but Alex informed them that it was not for sale. And when you knew him well, a visit to Alex's tailor shop and cleaning establishment was always an occasion for a cup of Turkish coffee and a slice of baklava or a chunk of kubra. Anna, his American-born wife, had learned well the secrets of making the hot, thick, fragrant Eastern coffee, and his call of "Coffee Mama," pitch and tone that he must have used when he called out olive oil for sale as he peddled the streets in the old world city, always brought a steaming copper pot of the exotic brew and a pair of tiny cups. Alexander Zatini Agee was a sportsman. During his years in Idaho, he learned the technique of hunting wild rabbits in the sagebrush country of the Inland Empire. He knew when the rabbits were ripe for the eating, when they should not be touched, how they were best prepared, and how to serve them. And when the Christmas of the late autumn and early winter came over the Northwest, Alex would take down his shotgun and head for the sagebrush country east of the mountains to return with dozens upon dozens of long-legged creatures. The back room of his shop would be filled with the meaty animals hanging in rows, and no good friend looking in for a welcoming Taconius could get away without a rabbit for his stew pot. Perhaps you wonder how Alexander Zatini Agee, a man who had known the whole world and had it all to choose from, selected Grays Harbor as a place to settle for his last years of his life. It is remarkable, but not if you know the story. You see, Alex was an acquaintance of one of the one-time Idaho fighters, Leo Lomsky, and the Model Cleaners was one of the enterprises in which Leo put his earnings from the fight game. Leo's sister operated the establishment, but Leo wanted someone behind the counter who knew the cleaning and tailoring business. He sent for Alex, and the little Macedonian became the partner of the battling pole. And speaking of Leo, the other night reminded us of one of his more colorful partners. It was in the spring of 1947 that Alexander Zatini Agee gave up the fight, and his last years had been a real battle, the hardest he'd ever fought. A lingering illness finally laid him low, though the spirit of the little man remained indomitable until the end. And the departure from the harbor scene closed the story of a fabulous neighbor of ours whose lust for life and for living and the appreciation he had for the world was exceeded by no one that I've ever known. Now, George, a few words from our sponsor. How much the man, Alexander Zatini Agee, most of us knew, we are never quite certain, for there was so much of this worldly little man, so much color and zestful living, so much of the activities and antics, the minstrels and the student, that one might know him for years without having exhausted his well of information and stories. But whatever you know about him, from his word of mouth or decades to the collectors or humanitarian, his personalities could fail to discover Alexander Zatini Agee without the feeling that here was a remarkable man, and no lover of the finer things could fail to enjoy the fragrance of the aroma that Alex made lustrous in his tiny cups of Turkish coffee, his musical speech, his dramatic gestures, all smacking of the ways of life of Atlantis in disappearing times from the business world like ours. And as a neighbor of ours whose very presence among us reminds us good to contemplate, as we accord tonight Alex Bora, whom the Turks called Alexander Zatini Agee, a page in our hometown scrapbook. Thanks for listening.